Hi everyone, this is a slightly lengthier YouTube preview of my very popular horse tutorial. There is a minute-long preview already available on my public YouTube channel, but as this one has been so highly requested in a lengthier lesson, in a lengthier form, I thought I would slow it down and just take you through my process. This particular lesson on my Patreon channel is created just using pastel pencils. I normally use a mix of soft pastel sticks, but pastel pencils as well at the base stage. But I know a lot of people don't always like working with soft pastels just because they can be a little bit messy. So I thought I would release one tutorial. I've also got another dog tutorial that is created purely using pastel pencils. The reason I personally like to use soft pastel sticks at the base stage is because I find the pigment is a lot richer and they just blend so beautifully. But if you are working really small, like I'm working here, this portrait was about 11 by 11 inches, then you can absolutely use pastel pencils and they can be a lot more precise as well, which is really beneficial when you are working small like this. So you'll see so with this portrait, I started off on the muzzle. And I always start off with my darkest tones first. There's quite a lot of these deep tones going on the nose, but there's also some light tones as well. So what I'm doing at the base stage here is just breaking down all of those different sections. So instead of blocking down one solid tone and then trying to lighten on top, it's a really good idea at the base stage just to start to separate all of these different areas. So your dark areas, your medium areas, and your light areas as well. And what that's going to do at the base stage is just begin to bring some three dimension, some shape into the nose, make it look really nice and rounded. If you just start off with some flat tones, just one or two at the base stage, then you're leaving it to the detail stage to try and get in all of those extra tones and all of those different gradients as well. So the medium tones, the light tones, these dark tones as well. So it's a very good idea at the base stage to try and block as much as you can. So block those different tones in and the different sections, so the gradient. This horse is full of really rich, deep tones. So there's lots of orange, there's lots of the kind of pink based browns as well. So I'm going to be using quite a variety of different tones. In my tutorials, I do provide a materials list to go along with the reference photo and the outline as well. But obviously, I appreciate not everyone has a wide collection of pastel tones, and depending on where you are in the world, some brands aren't available. So if you do want alternatives, then you can absolutely contact me and I'll see what brand you've got and I will provide some alternatives for you. For example, the Caran d'Ache Dark Flesh 748, which I use a lot in brown subjects. It's very, very similar to the Walnut Brown from Faber-Castell 177. So if you don't have any Caran d'Ache tones, any of the brands, then you can absolutely use some very similar alternatives from the brands that you have. Now, this particular horse, the reference photo obviously comes with a bridle. What I'm teaching you is to create without the bridle. So sometimes clients will ask for the portrait without a collar, without a bridle, or if it's a wildlife portrait, that might be something in the way, like a branch across the lioness that you just want to get rid of. So I'm kind of teaching you to just follow the structure underneath what's blocking the way. So you just kind of look at the structure that's peeking through either side of what's on top, and you just follow it through to meet what's coming out the other side, basically. So that's very important with structure like this in the face. It's quite hard to see what's underneath, but generally you can see the structure either side, and so you just kind of follow that guide. So there's this lovely white area of the nose here. I started off with a very light tone, white tone, and I'm mixing in some pink just to tint it with your really light, pristine areas, which don't hold much detail because they are so bright. It's often better to start off with a really light tone and then just tint on top to create some structure, as you can see I've done here. And I'm just starting to work the edge slightly with some of these grey hairs, and what that does is it really softens the divide between the white and the black. So you've got this border between light and dark. That's a really dramatic tonal change, which we do want to avoid. when you get black fur going into white fur, there's always going to be some kind of a bleed. So a bleed is basically a tone in between light and dark, or really vibrant and non-vibrant, which is kind of in the middle, and it just softens the two areas together really nicely and helps to just give that really gradual diffusion into the next area. It's really important to keep picking out structure within a nose like this. There's so much lovely detail going on, so much shape, so much structure, which you do want to recreate. Otherwise, it's just not going to look realistic at all. So I'm not actually onto the final detail stage just yet. I'm very much still shaping areas at this kind of middle base stage. So we're just pulling out these little wrinkles going on underneath the nostril, and then I can start to work in some details on top. It's very important to get shape and structure down before you work in any details, because it's going to be really difficult to work areas of structure after you've worked details in, or try and reshape areas. So try and take your time. I know base stages can take forever, but just be patient, take as many breaks as you need, and then you can come back and you'll see here I'm starting to work in these lovely details, outlining the nostril as well, which just helps to make it pop against the paper. I always like to give a little bit of a dark outline around my subjects, and it just pulls them out of the paper really, really nicely. So just starting to pull out these little whiskers here. I always say try and go a little bit quicker towards the end of the whisker, and that just helps it to kind of fade out slightly and get a little bit thinner. The harder you press with pastel pencils, the thicker the line's going to come out. So if you want the little whisker to be thinner at the end, which they always are, then start heavier at the base, so the root of the whisker, press a little bit harder, and then just try and just lift your pressure a little bit as you get towards the end, and that just naturally will make it a little bit thinner. And try and quicken your hand as well. When you quicken your hand, it just again loosens that pressure and you get a lovely thin tip. So I always soften as I go with my pastel portraits, as you can see here. It just helps to blur everything, it smooths, and it makes everything really nice and seamless, which especially at the base stage, as I'm building up these rich tones, is very important. With our base, we want to try and avoid any sharp lines, anything harsh going on or too obvious. So if we get a nice soft base, then it really helps us when we add our little hair details on top. You don't need to be kind of covering up any areas or muting any areas because they look a little bit too harsh at the base stage. Everything's nice and smooth, so I can now start adding in these lovely little strokes. Horse fur is a little bit trickier, I find, than dog fur, because it's got this really smooth, velvety look. Because the hairs are so short, especially with these warm bloods, you kind of need to create this velvety, seamless finish. And I find the way to do that, which obviously I take you through in the tutorial, is just creating very smooth, short strokes and making sure I compact them as well. And that just, as you can see, it gives the illusion of detailing, but without making the fur look really hairy or really long either. So a useful tip, if you're finding some of your areas are maybe looking a little bit too washed out, so they're looking a bit too light after you've gone in with an ivory or a white, and you just want to make them a touch more colourful, you can just tint over the top like I just did with a sienna, and that just helps to bring a little bit more colour into them without darkening them too much. So I'm just going around with a Cretacolor, adding in some of these little blemishes, just a few more dark details, and then going in with some more highlight. So this lesson is about 6 hours long. It's full length over on my Patreon channel. It's available in the full animal and backlog tier and the VIP tier as well. The VIP tier means you get a critique as well a month. So any portrait that you've created, it doesn't have to be a tutorial, just drop me an email with a picture and I'll let you know how to just elevate it and take it to the next level. All of my lessons come with a voiceover, so a very, very detailed voiceover. It's a lot more detailed than obviously what I'm taking you through now, which is generally talking you through how Patreon works and a little bit about this tutorial. But obviously in the voiceover itself for the lesson, it's taking you through each tone. So as I get onto each tone, I explain why I'm using it, where I'm using it, and the number as well, and the name. So if you want to buy it or find it in your collection, then you can absolutely do so. So I'm just picking out some of these little white whiskers here. This is actually my Caran d'Ache Chinese white, which is one of my brightest whites. I love to use this for final highlights. But if you don't have this, the next brightest I would say is the Faber-Castell white. The Stabilo white, the titanium white 100, it's lovely, but I generally use it for the just prepping areas with a layer of white before I then go in a little bit lighter. It doesn't quite pack as much as of a punch. It's still lovely, but if you want areas to just pop out so much more, especially those highlights in the eyes, then something a little bit brighter is great to have in your collection. Similar to my Cretacolor black, this is just so much darker than a regular black, but again, I appreciate not everyone can get hold of Cretacolor wherever you are in the world. So you can absolutely use a black. Before I used Cretacolor, I used my Stabilo black, which is number 750. It's still beautiful. It's lovely and deep and dark. The Cretacolor just really creates depth, so it's brilliant for nostrils and eyes and areas in the shadow as well that you just want to make that much darker. And it's really good as well just for making areas a little bit more striking and just stand out a touch more. So if you can get hold of a Cretacolor black, then I would recommend using it. It's absolutely changed the way my work looks. So I'm really thrilled that I discovered it, and it was actually through another artist. I can't remember who it was, but yeah, it's great getting tips from other artists because we all have different ways of working, and it's precisely why I'm creating these tutorials, because when I first started with pastels, I was hopeless. I just didn't know where to turn to for advice, and I very much went through the hard, long process of discovering how pastels worked. But actually, I mean, they do say that, you know, learning and making mistakes does lead to, you know, creating better works, because you're having to go through learning what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. But I definitely took the long route. So having lessons like this, I can teach you a speedier way of getting to where you need to be, and mistakes that are really annoying that you can avoid as well. And obviously, you know, the tools as well. It's taken me a long time to work out what tones work and what don't. Some are more highly pigmented than others. And when I say highly pigmented, it means if you look on the barrel of your pastel pencils, they have these stars, and the lower the star rating, so if it's only got 1 star, it means that it's a little bit more dull, and it's not got a very good light fast rating. And light fast means it's going to last a lot longer. So obviously if you've got a client and they want to hang the picture on the wall, using these pastel pencils which are more light fast means that these pastel pencils are going to last a lot longer. They're not going to fade quite as much. So ideally you want to try and work with pastel pencils that are higher than a 1 for sure. There are some pastel pencils where the tones are so unique that I have to use them even though they've only got 1 rating. There's only about 1 or 2 of those tones, but generally, as I say, you do want to try and work as high as you can, especially when you're working with these vibrant tones. You do want to make sure that these subjects, which are so bright, that they last a long time, so years and years to come. So you'll see with this horse head, similar to the nose, I've started to break down those different areas. So the different tones that sit within the areas, and then the areas that hold highlights. So the cheekbone, that's obviously got a lot of light, and then there's some light just on the left of this dark section here. So picking those all out at the base stage I'm getting all of that shape in there. And then when I add the details, I know exactly where to put the light hairs, the medium hairs, and the dark hairs. So it's going to look very, very messy for the majority of your base stage. Base work is never, ever neat, unfortunately. But at least towards the final stages of the base stage, you're going to start seeing the face look a lot more three-dimensional. So you'll see here, I'm at the final stages of the base stage, and although you can tell it's not finished, it's looking okay. It's kind of making sense a little bit. We've got lots of structure in there, and if you blur your eyes or squint when you look at the artwork, it kind of almost looks finished. So that's the stage you need to be at when you are at the end of your base stage, before you add any details in. So I'm just working a little bit more light around the eye here, and just some different vibrant tones as well, just to make sure we are where we should be with our tones in our face before we add any details in. And I'm starting to skim my lead now across the paper to get some movement into the fur. So starting to create some texture as well, which helps to thicken up the fur without making it really thick. So obviously horsehair is very thin and it's very fine. So what I'm doing is starting to create some of the direction at the base stage, and then we don't need to add quite so many hairs at the detail stage to get that direction in. Obviously, the more hairs you add, the hairier it's going to be. So we want to try and get some blunt direction in at the base stage. So it means we don't need to add quite so many hairs in there. We can keep this horse quite short-haired. So all of these tones that I'm using, obviously I'll be taking you through in the full length lesson. It's a lot of oranges, a lot of browns, and some of these lovely light tones as well. So it's mainly, I'll just name a few. There's the burnt ochre from Faber-Castell 187. There's the terracotta as well, which is slightly lighter. That's also from Faber-Castell. I'm using some yellows as well. So Bista from Faber-Castell 179. The burnt umber from Faber-Castell 280. Couple of Caran d'Ache tones. It's mainly the dark flesh tone from Caran d'Ache, which is number 748, but the alternative you can use from Faber-Castell is 177 walnut brown. I also am using heaps of my burnt sienna from Faber-Castell 283. I would say that tone in particular is one of my most popular ones in my pastel collection. It's the one that I always seem to be ordering over and over again, because it just ends up getting used so much. It's this lovely, rich, red-based brown, and it's honestly perfect for so many things, for eyes, fur as well. It's so lovely and vibrant. It does make areas pop so much more. There is also the burnt sienna from Stabilo 670. This tone is, the name is the same, but you need to be careful because it's not the same in terms of its tone. It's a lot more red, and I do use it in my pastel works. It's really good to just bring areas to life even more, but you do have to be careful not to use it too much. So if I want my eye, for example, to just really look nice and fiery and rich, then I use a tiny bit of burnt sienna in, but only really as a tint. I hardly ever use it raw on paper, so just solely on its own. I'll always mix it in with other tones and tint, and it just helps to bring the area to life a lot more. For sheen on rich dark fur like this, you'll see there I just used a little bit of grey. That was my cold grey 3 from Stabilo, and it just helps to stop the area from, you don't want to add anything like a white because it will make the fur look white, basically like it's an old horse. So by adding a sheen of grey over the top, it just helps to make the fur look really nice and shiny instead of like it's a really old horse. All of these little nuggets of information and tips and tricks are obviously all in my full-length tutorials on Patreon. There are now over 3 years worth of lessons. I've got a huge backlog, So it is a subscription service. However, you can stay as long or short as you want. If you only want to stay for 1 month, then you can cancel. It's very, very easy. You're not tied into any contracts. Equally, if you have your eye on one tutorial only, so for example, this horse, and you don't want any other tutorials, you're only interested in one, you can purchase as a one-off. You will need to contact me via email, or you can comment below in this lesson, or drop me a message on my social channels, and what I can do is email you across the link to that specific lesson and then the payment information. But that's absolutely very, very possible to do. Very, very nearly there with this head. It's just adding a few more details in just to bring it to life. You'll see how I haven't really been adding too many little individual hair strokes. It's mainly just using the side of my lead just to create some rough hair lines, some detailing, and then it kind of starts to take shape and take form itself. So just kind of random, almost mark making in a general direction that we can see in the photograph. But if you make enough of these marks, and they do start to make sense. So I'm just picking some into the white area here, the stripe down the center, just to break up that divide between the white and the dark. So onto the ears next. I always find ears are the trickiest. I don't know why. I think everyone has a specific area of an animal that they're working on that they just find so much more challenging than all other areas. I know some people really struggle with noses, some with eyes. I think mine is ears, but I've definitely really improved over the years and started to learn to get a lot more shape into them. So we're using the same tones that we use in the face, obviously, to make sure that the ears are consistent with the rest of the horse. So again, I'm just blocking in these different tones, so the light areas, medium areas, and the dark areas, to start to work some shape in and just mark in those different areas so that when I start to add my details in, it's really easy to follow. So using my Stabilo Black to work in the dark areas. When I moved to the neck, I did say earlier that I only use pastel pencils in this tutorial. I will actually be using a Smink soft pastel stick just because the neck is a little bit larger an area. So I do want to cover a little bit more ground, and with pastel pencils, you want to try not to waste them too much. They're a bit more expensive than pastel sticks. So I will on this occasion just be using that soft pastel stick for the neck. However, you can obviously absolutely use a black pastel pencil. But I just thought I would raise that now in case any of you are wondering when I come to the neck why I'm using a pastel stick. So I'm just creating a nice smooth texture here, but also getting plenty of direction in with my pastel pencils. So these lovely blunt strokes. I personally prefer to work slightly more on the blunt side with my pastel pencils. There are a lot of artists out there who work really, really fine, which is perfect for some things, I think, like whiskers, but my personal way of working is slightly more blunt, just because I prefer the slightly more painterly effect, which in my works you'll notice they're a little bit more, not abstract, but some people have said they're a bit more cartoony, but they're definitely less hyper realistic fine art and more bold, I would say, a bit more modern. So I think that's possibly me working a little bit blunter. It's creating this really nice painterly effect, which I personally prefer because I like to tell that it's a painting. If it's so hyper realistic and just looks like a photograph, then I think, well, what's the point of having that over a photograph, basically? But that's just my personal preference. So moving on to the mane, just starting to block in slightly some of this direction, so I know kind of how to work around it when I come to the neck. And then final little details added into the ear here, just a little bit more highlight before I move on to the neck. Now that I'm finished with the ears, I'm moving down to the neck. Generally, I always do the neck last. So this is my Smink pastel stick I'm using, which is in the color Serious Black. This is my darkest black that I use. So it's great for those areas that, as you can see in the photograph, it's kind of, you can hardly see any details at all. It's just kind of merging into the background. And then I'm starting to work some nice, rich brown and reddy brown tones around it to create some color and some evidence of this light hitting the neck as we move upwards. So with this base, I'm doing these blunt strokes, and that's starting to bring in a little bit of texture and just a little bit of fur direction as well. With your base stages, it's always a good idea to not only obviously block in those different sections of color, but to get some kind of movement in as well. And getting movement in at the base stage, it just starts to give you a little bit more help when it comes to the detail stage, because you kind of know where to put those hairs and which direction. You don't have to check in with a reference photo quite so much. So I do recommend doing this at the base stage. So if you're working with your pastel pencils, then you can kind of work in the slight direction that the fur is taking. So just pulling these strokes round. If it's curving round, you just follow that direction, creating a nice smooth line. So with this portrait, I didn't want to include that dark background, and neither did the client. So I've created a little bit more neck or evidence of neck here, but I'm still making it nice and dark at the bottom, and that just draws attention up to the face as well. If you've got the neck which is really light and full of lots and lots of detail, it can often draw attention away from the face. So this is a lovely, lovely portrait because it's just all eyes are kind of drawn up to the horse's face itself, and you can see all of those beautiful details. So I'm creating a little bit of light just down the bottom here. You can see in the photograph there is some slight evidence going on there. And with this portrait, I did fade the neck slightly out at the bottom. You do want to avoid a really sharp sort of edge of a neck, because it kind of looks like the horse has been decapitated. So just by softly fading it out, it gives a more natural effect. So working a little bit more highlight down this area of structure here. Although we don't want to get quite as much detail in on the neck as we did the face, we do obviously still want to pick out lots of shape, lots of structure. So the highlights are really, really important. So I'm just using a variety of light tones here. So ivory, a golden ochre light, some light greys as well. If you're finding your horse is looking a little bit too vibrant, so just a touch unnatural, maybe a little bit too orange, you can tone things down with grey tones because they're neutral. They just help to balance everything out and just tone down some of the bright colours. So the mane is the last section of this portrait. We do want to get the neck complete before we work the mane on top, otherwise you're going to be ending up erasing the tips of the hairs on the mane by working your neck base in. So we do want to make sure we get this done at the end like this. So just starting to pull out some of these tips here, which, as I mentioned, if you don't get your neck base in and your details in, you're going to end up having to erase these ends here. So I'm just working a little bit more of this colour down the bottom here just while I have it, to darken it up. Often as you're working through your portrait, you'll notice areas sometimes might look a little bit lighter to you as you're working through. So you can just go back and darken areas up if you need to, or lighten them as well. And this is a ultramarine blue light I'm adding into the mane, which is a lovely light blue tone, and that just helps get a little bit of shine into areas. So manes are obviously lovely and shiny, so I just got a few touches in there before just going back over with my Cretacolor here. I always do this towards the end, just helps to darken up any areas that need to be deepened, and it just helps to make the subject look really nice and striking. So just working a little bit more darkness round the back here. And then final touches to this portrait, I'm just working some highlights in, just on the neck there, just to make it pop a little bit more. But that is a preview of my horse, which is available on Patreon as a full length, +5 hour long lesson. Any questions, please just pop them in the comment box below.